Chapter 7, Saipan. The Marianas. Next stop, Saipan. Saipan is one of the second largest of the Marianas Islands and was the biggest of the islands we had operated from to this point, some 47 square miles. About 32,000 Japanese troops had defended the island against the U.S. Marine assault, and only some 2,000 were taken prisoner, along with 12,000 Japanese civilians. Incredibly, it was estimated that 8,000 more civilians, men, women, and children, committed suicide by jumping off the cliffs at Marpy Point, having been told that if they were captured by the Marines, they would be tortured and killed. Saipan was described in Navy manuals of the day as an island ringed by sea life: sharks, barracuda, sea snakes, anemones, razor-sharp coral, polluted waters, poisonous fish, and giant clams that could shut on a man like a bear trap. The joys of life ashore included a variety of things: leprosy, typhus, filariasis, yaws, typhoid, dengue fever, dysentery, saber-grass, insects of many varieties, snakes, and giant lizards. The rules were basic. Don't eat anything growing on the island, don't drink the water, and don't approach the inhabitants. Another Pacific paradise. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the three major islands of the Marianas Group, were now free of Japanese control, with the exception of a number of stragglers in the hills. An interesting note: Japanese were still being captured after the securing of the islands. In fact, years after the war was over, several Japanese were found still hiding in the hills. Because the Marianas are only about 1,350 miles south of Japan's island of Honshu, they became the major base for the 20th Air Force and their B-29 bombers for raids on the Japanese homeland. They are now making regular raids on Japan, some 3,000 miles round trip, about 15 hours total airtime. Also, the Marianas were a major staging base for the coming invasion of Iwo Jima, one of the volcano islands about 700 miles north of Saipan, and they would also be instrumental in mounting the coming invasion of Okinawa on April 1st, 1945. It is always sad to see the rivalries between the services impact the tactics and strategy of the war, and in the long run probably cost more lives. But the military is fraught with human nature and egos, just like the rest of the world. The Associated Press in 1946 reported a relatively unknown but very real aspect of the B-29 operations from the Marianas. The inter-service rivalry between the Navy, Army Air Force, and Army was highly defensive, and a perfect example was the Marianas operation. When the decision was made to begin bombing from the Marianas, the concern was the B-29s would violate the air over the so-called MacArthur's territory, as well as the air over Nimitz's territory. The solution decided upon was for the Armed Forces Joint Chiefs of Staff to establish the 20th Air Force under its direct control with General Hap Arnold as executive agent for the Joint Chiefs. B-29 operations really stretched the relationships between the Navy, the Army, Air Force, and Army in the Pacific practically to the breaking point. Tanapag. The seaplane base at Tanapag is on the western side of the island of Saipan and had been a large Japanese sea drome. We had been through here a few months before, but the changes were unbelievable. New roads, new barracks, almost civilized, and best of all, a renovated seaplane ramp area. The enemy. The Japanese, even though I believe most of us did not really understand them, were incredible. With a terrible deficiency in weapons after the first year and a half of the war, they still carried on undeterred. By mid-1944, they had lost the cream of their Air Force. The really good pilots had all been killed. They had lost almost all of their aircraft carrier fleet, as well as all but a few capital ships. However, they had a fervent patriotism and loyalty to their emperor, as evidenced by their kamikazes and other suicide units. They had no great aversion to casualties. They were willing to die for their beliefs. I elaborated on this philosophy of dying for the emperor in the introduction. We dealt with somewhat the mentality again in fighting the Korean and Vietnam wars, and I, for one, am not sure that I yet understand it. Although I must admit, the more I read about the air war in the U.S. Army Air Force in Europe during World War II, there was also an inherent patriotism and loyalty present. When the odds on air crews in the 8th Air Force flying over Europe, particularly in 43 and early 44, were only 1 in 3 that they would finish the prescribed 25 missions. The bravery of these air crews and aversion to casualties did not impede the round-the-clock bombing of Fortress Europe. The B-29 crews flying out from the Marianas had a projected survival rate of 16 missions. Although these 8th Air Force and B-29 missions were not flown with the intent of suicide like the kamikazes, the specter of certain death was always there. So it would seem that we can make patriots and heroes out of anyone under any circumstance if they truly believe in what they're doing. Operations begin. Beginning on January 31st, we were flying 3 daily patrols, 600-mile sectors out of Saipan and 1 local night anti-submarine patrol. On February 5, the squadron assumed coverage of 4 daily long-range patrols, 750-mile sectors. This included patrols to Iwo Jima prior to the invasion, which would take place later in the month. A new squadron, VPB 208, arrived in February, and they took over our night patrol. We continued the 4 daily patrols through the middle of the month when VPB 208 took over 1, leaving us with just 3. A lot of my shipmates might not agree, but flying over the ocean to me was not boring. I've heard people say it's flat and uninformative, not like land with all the towns, houses, fields, roads, and rivers. The ocean has a personality and a certain uniqueness about it. It can be calm, it can be cruel, and it always is changing. There's a never-ending mystique about it. Everyday life. On the 1st of February, the squadron had its first transfer back to the States, except for injured personnel. Lieutenant Commander Rex Rader, PPC of Crew 11, left to return home to begin postgraduate work at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. His assignment as squadron flight officer was taken over by Ken Iman, and at the same time several other changes were made in the squadron's officer and flight crew personnel. The first days of Saipan, before the Chandeleur arrived, brought a return back to nature living and roughing it. Initially, the officers were living in makeshift barracks, Quonset huts still under construction and without lights, water, or bathroom facilities. There was also a chronic shortage of cots and blankets. The enlisted personnel endured even ruder accommodations, doubling up in tents without floors or screening. I remember sleeping in one of them with only a canvas tent section as bedclothes. It was surprisingly cold at night and didn't get much sleep until the situation was alleviated after a few days or so with the issue of blankets. Food was not too bad, but again, not a lot of real meat, only Spam, canned sausage, and canned corned beef, and SOS for staples. Every night, Marine Guards patrolled around the seaplane base at Tanapag Harbor. Because there were still lots of Japanese stragglers on the island, the guards would challenge any person walking after dark and ask for the day's password, which usually was an automobile name like Ford or Dodge. One night I was crossing the ramp and was challenged with, "Who goes here?" I desperately started to rack my brain. What was the password for today? After what seemed to me an interminable time in panic, I rattled off Oldsmobile, Chevrolet, Cadillac, LaSalle, Studebaker, etc., 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 etc. Fortunately, the guard realized if I knew all those cars, I must be okay, but he told me to hope that the guard next time would be his patient. Crew 14's purchasing experts, Harry Gardner and Bob Garrison, arranged for the purchase of several bottles of whiskey from some entrepreneurs who flew NATS, Naval Air Transport Service. After some hard bargaining, they purchased several bottles of Old Rocking Chair for the princely sum of $35 per bottle, a rather nondescript but palatable drink which sold for $2 to $3 per bottle in the States. We were convinced that the Nats crews were getting rich while flying the mail from the West Coast and Hawaii to the islands. They probably retired off of the earnings from their bootlegging business when they got discharged. Despite the discomfort, we did enjoy our first respite on solid ground for more than a few hours since our days at Perry Island. It gave us some sightseeing opportunities, wandering up through the hills and caves for some impromptu explorations of unrestricted areas and some restricted ones, always with our sidearms. Then visiting some of the other battle sites in the B-29 base, exchanging stories with the B-29 bomber crews. This is the first real walking around time since we were at Kaneohe the preceding year. We had a great squadron beer party, and now had a chance to play softball and volleyball. We also got our plane on the ramp for some much-needed maintenance and cleaning. Finally, on February 11th, the Chandeleur arrived in the harbor, and once more we moved back aboard to the more familiar but cramped quarters. The Navy was a big believer in movies as a morale builder. They were almost a nightly event on board ship or shore stations. Saipan had a decent outdoor theater, and I remember we were enjoying a movie one night when gunfire broke out. It turned out that a Japanese movie buff had been spotted by some Marine sentries, and they shot him. Several humorous incidents during our stay at Saipan related to Crews 9 and 7. Pete Krasinowski of Crew 9 told a story about one of the ordnancemen in his crew nicknamed Gandhi. On buoy watch one night, Gandhi was on watch and trying to stay alert for possible Japanese swimmers. Indeed, one PB-2Y Coronado flying boat had been destroyed by a Japanese swimmer in Tanapag Harbor, and that made most of us a little more alert. Anyway, as Pete related, this particular night at 0200, a clip of automatic fire from a carbine awakened all of us on buoy watch, and we heard Gandhi shouting, "I just saw a Jap in the water." We all jumped up, spent several minutes looking around, and saw nothing, so returned to our sacks. Later, Gandhi confessed he was bored and tired and just wanted a little action, so he decided to start a commotion. It was later suggested to him that he was not too smart to make a move like that, as the whole harbor could have opened fire, which might have resulted in some serious damage. Bernard Pappy Mountain, Crew 7, told me a story about one day at Tanapag when their plane was on the ramp for some periodic checks. Pappy said, "I just happened to be on the plane at the passageway just after the flight deck. On the forward bulkhead was the wobble pump for draining the sumps in the fuel system. When it was worked, it pumped gas overboard just aft of the starboard beaching gear hatch. On the same bulkhead was a relief tube for urinating, the outlet of which was just above the wobble pump outlet on the hull. One of the crew had been working hard on some greasy job and was standing down on the ramp, ready to rinse his hands with a little 100-octane avgas. I, Mountain, heard him shout, 'Is there anybody topside?' I replied, 'Yeah, I'm up here.' He then asked, 'Would you hit the wobble pump a couple of times?' I said, 'Okay, wait a minute.' Because I happened to be right there preparing to use the relief tube, I did that first. Needless to say, the air turned blue with verbal abuse, as it wasn't the gas that came out of the drain. The guy with the dirty hands was pissed on as well as off, and I was rolling on the deck with laughter. JADO, Jet Assisted Takeoff. The Navy's first use of JADO, Jet Assisted Takeoff, basically jet fuel inside of a strong pressurized metal bottle, was first described in the Los Angeles Times on February 6, 1945. The incident reported was a story about getting a stranded PBM-5 airborne off the Columbia River near Yuma, Arizona. The first use of JADO in a combat area was at Iwo Jima, also in February 45, by VPB-19 flying PBM-3Ds. PBM-5 was the first model, however, to be factory equipped for JADO bottles, 2 on each side of the hull on the waist section. These units could be fired individually. The top 2 would be fired for takeoff, and the bottom 2 were then available for an open sea takeoff if needed. Our squadron first used it during operations at Okinawa. Patrols in action. We were still flying regular patrols covering the sector to Iwo Jima, about 700 miles to the north. On February 12th, a large number of ships began leaving Tanapag Harbor. Battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and hundreds of landing craft and cargo ships, all headed north for the planned invasion of Iwo Jima on the 17th. Iwo Jima was one of the most savage battles of the Pacific War. Initially, it had been projected as a 2-week operation. However, it raged for at least 4 weeks, and mopping up operations took a bit longer. The United States had over 24,000 casualties, some 6,800 killed, and about 18,000 wounded. Of the estimated 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoners. The rest fought to the death. In the early PM on the 19th, while Crew 1 was on the inbound leg of their patrol, Rodney Powers, operating the radar, informed Norm Lorenzen, "I have a surface target. It's about 4 miles distant at 11 o'clock. Lorenzen turned towards the target, and at a distance of 3.5 miles, Jewel Griffin reported sighting a wake. The wake was clearly visible to the naked eye from an altitude of about 1,800 feet, and was first thought to be from a high-speed boat. As the plane got closer, both pilots and the bow lookout, Jim Hubbard, identified it as a submarine running on the surface with only its conning tower showing. Knowing that the area was not a safe haven for U.S. subs, Lorenzen started an attack run. 4 depth charges were released from an altitude of about 50 to 75 feet on a course of 360 degrees across the sub's projected track. As the depth charges fell, the sub was crash diving, but the conning tower was still visible. Actually, the conning tower was just dipping beneath the surface when the plane passed over. The crew agreed that the conning tower was maybe 12 to 15 feet in length, and Griffin saw a projection from it was an antenna or periscope. Jim Kaczynski in the deck turret saw the first depth charge hit. He reported to the flight deck, I'm certain the first 3 depth charges hit the water about 50 feet short of the conning tower, and on a path that would be a perfect point on the sub's projected track. I also could see part of the sub just before the charges exploded. From the tail turret, Mike McKeague reported, "Saw the explosions and a portion of the sub appeared momentarily in the churning water, then it sank out of sight." He later described what he saw as appearing squashed or crinkled in appearance and painted a dull gray color. Several other crew members observed large quantities of bubbles rising from the swirl left by the explosions. Then oil began surfacing in large quantities and began to cover an area about 600 feet across. Lorenzen continued to search the area for another hour or so, but finally had to terminate his search and head back to base as fuel was critical. An all-night search of the area by our planes found no further traces of the sub. It was obvious from the debriefing that the attack was well carried out and very accurate, and it was concluded that the sub was seriously damaged or sunk. So VPB-21's anti-submarine work continued in a positive vein. Patrols continued on schedule as the invasion of Iwo Jima was now in full swing. We had a close call one day returning from a patrol to Iwo. As we approached Saipan, it was blanketed by a heavy fog, particularly over Tanapag Harbor. We literally couldn't find the landing area in the Seadrome. Joe Durda told Charlie Ray, who was operating the radar, "Charlie, you have to find the landing area for me or we'll really be in big trouble. Neither Melmar nor I can see a thing from up here." Charlie fortunately recalled that there was a wrecked Japanese ship in the harbor to the south side of our runway. So using that as a landmark, he began to zero Durda in. Down, down we went, feeling our way through impenetrable mist. After several passes, Durda spotted a small opening in the fog. Now only about 50 feet off the water, he immediately descended through the opening and made a perfect landing. "Just another day at the office," he said as we tied up at the buoy. What was really scary to me, as we groped through the fog that day, I was sitting in the tail turret and suddenly hearing the whir of engines and looking up into the fog and seeing a B-29 pass over within 30 or 40 feet of our tail. I guess he was searching for his runway too. It was an awfully nice feeling to get on the water and out of the B-29's traffic pattern. The occasional fog was just one of the problems for takeoffs and landings. Any of the busy harbors in the Pacific were always full of the flotsam and jetsam of war. This debris was from scores of ships and the remnants of battles. I remember talking with PBM crews who flew for a few days from Iwo Jima, and they said often they had to taxi a mile or so away from their anchorage for takeoff because the water was so congested with debris and bodies. For 3 days in February, the squadron took over responsibility for ASP coverage of the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, which had been badly damaged off Iwo Jima and was heading back to Enewetak for repairs. These patrols averaged about 12 to 15 hours and were successfully carried out by crews 6, 10, and 16. Operations functioned very smoothly at Saipan. In fact, it was probably our best rest period since we left Kaneohe. So we took advantage of it by concentrating on further training. A number of the junior pilots were qualified as first pilots, and several new PPCs were also qualified. We were delighted when Walter Melmar was qualified as PPC and took out his first patrol. It was to Iwo Jima, and it went without a hitch. Asleep at the switch. Bob Keel of Crew 12, in a moment of retrospection, told a funny story on himself. We were on patrol out of Saipan, flying in some low-lying clouds that had covered most of our search area. I was operating the radar and must have dozed off with my head against the shield on the radar scope. I obviously didn't see a large number of blips come up on the screen. When we hit a break in the clouds, several of the crew looked around. There were frenzied cries on the intercom. "There are a whole bunch of damn fighters all around us back here." They were F-6F Hellcats from a carrier, and they were motioning us away from the area. It soon became apparent why. On the ocean below us, a raid from horizon to horizon, was Task Force 58. All kinds of ships with all of their guns trained directly on us. Fortunately, the fighters weren't trigger happy, and we moved away quickly as suggested. I never dozed on patrol again. The more we flew, I often wondered why we got so much training. I knew a lot of guys who flew in the Army Air Corps, and many of the air crews were composed of gunners, a radioman, and a mechanic. The gunners went to gunnery school, period. The Navy, on the other hand, sent me to 21 weeks of aviation machinist mate school, then to radar and radio school, and aerial gunnery school. However, it became apparent that the Navy was wise, as the cross-training, though time-consuming, did allow for multi-purpose crews. This was particularly important for the type of flying we did, where 10 to 12 hours was the norm. The cross-training allowed for breaks and thus increased alertness and attention to whatever task was being performed. As we flew relatively low, it always seemed hot, and this was magnified for me as I spent a good deal of time in the tail turret. In this small plexiglass enclosed area, it was often hard to stay completely alert. However, I developed a routine of continually scanning the sea and the sky in segments, first from left and then from the right. This helped me concentrate, and I would purposely use the turret's manual control to crank the turret to different positions just to break the monotony. Mail call. Mail was truly the link with home, and mail call was always a welcome time. I was single and had no serious relationship at home, so I didn't dread the Dear John letters as so many did. Yank, one of the Army's great publications, had some funny letters in one issue that I came across recently. These copies are a bit tongue-in-cheek, but they're the type of letters that can make one quite sad when so far from home. The girlfriend letter. Snooky dear, I drove out to Potter's Perch the other night along the old mill road. You remember, don't you, dear? The moon was bright and the stars twinkled just like when you were there with me, and it made me feel so romantic. Some girls complained about the man shortage, but not me. Last night, 3 fellas took me to the movies, and afterwards they took turns with me out on the back porch, dancing. But don't worry, dear, they're all servicemen. I won't go out with a man except in uniform. One of them, Casper Clutcham, who's sort of blonde and cute and a Marine sergeant, says for me to tell you, everything is under control. He's awfully strong. Guess what we were drinking the other night? Those potent daiquiris that really make me almost forget myself. And I did tell you Casper is stationed just out of town and has promised to come over and see me real often. I couldn't very well refuse him because he said he was leaving for overseas almost any month now. I believe in doing my bit to help the servicemen because, after all, some of them are so far from home and don't know a soul in town. All my love, Alma. The old buddy letter. Dear Fred, I'm back in Dayton for another furlough, and I'm looking after Lulu, just like you asked me to. She's really a wonderful girl. What a smooth dancer. Boy, if she weren't your wife, I could really go for her myself. I feel I've gotten to know her almost better than you do. Almost. And boy, can she hold her liquor. We had dinner at the Cove tonight, and now we're back at your apartment. It's just about midnight, and while Lulu is slipping into something more comfortable, I thought I'd drop you a line. Ha ha, old man, I'm only kidding. Stay well and keep 'em flying. Your old buddy, Johnny. P.S. Lulu says hi. The letter from work. Dear Bill, all of us here at the company, from the office staff up to me, are thinking you boys constantly and are doing our part to help the war effort. We're all buying war bonds and cutting down on meat and butter, and some of the girls in the office are even rolling bandages on Saturday afternoon. Rationing is pretty grim now, steaks only twice a week, and no more cherries and cherry cokes. But we don't mind because the papers say you guys overseas are getting all the good things, and you certainly deserve them. Yes, sir, no one can say that the old company isn't well represented in the foxholes and trenches of our fighting fronts all over the globe. Raleigh is a warrant officer at Camp Dix, New Jersey. Jim is at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Harry's a chauffeur to a Marine colonel in Philadelphia. Van is way down in Texas, and Charlie is a quartermaster clerk in Georgia, and you're in the infantry in Italy. Give 'em hell, boy. We'll try to keep your job open until this mess is settled. Your friend, George Claxton, General Manager. March brings changes. On March 9th, the squadron passed a significant milestone when the squadron completed its 800th patrol in South Pacific Theater, exclusive of all administrative ferry test and forward movement flights. These missions were completed before the arrival of any relief crews, and nearly all were flown in forward combat areas. It is believed that no other Mariner squadron in forward area operations had equaled this record, which represented approximately 50 to 55 missions per crew. The shortest duration for any of our crews outside the continental U.S. was now 9 months. Predecessor squadrons operating under the old relief system normally returned to the States after from 6 to 7 months in the Pacific Theater. March also brought about a number of other changes. The arrival of a new model, the PBM-5, which would replace all of our PBM-3Ds. Several of the crews made flights to Ulithi and Kaneohe to pick up new planes. The PBM-5 incorporated a number of changes in equipment, including the more powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800-22 engines and improved radio and radar gear. So now the squadron faced a period of orientation to familiarize themselves with the equipment and systems on this new model. While the delivery of the new planes materially strengthened the squadron, the timing was difficult, as it was just 2 weeks until the move would begin to the Nansei Shoto, a chain of islands also called the Ryukyus, for the invasion of Okinawa. Another example of lack of communication and not knowing the big picture was this move. None of us had ever heard of Okinawa, so people scrambled trying to find out where it was and what it was like. However, everyone turned to and went to work overtime to ready the crews and the new planes for the upcoming operation. The second positive change was the arrival of the first relief crews, in keeping with the new Navy policy of not relieving whole squadrons, but rather individual crews. Selection of crews to be relieved was based on the number of factors, such as previous sea duty, time overseas on this tour, and family emergencies at home. While the arrival of new crews was positive from a morale standpoint, it also meant there'd be a consequent loss of experienced personnel, which caused some hardship and confusion. But these crews were well trained, and in the final analysis there were just a few minor problems. Further preparations for the coming move to Okinawa included a move back ashore to the seaplane base on March 17th. The Chandeleur is preparing to leave for the upcoming invasion. Fortunately, quarters ashore were much improved from what we experienced upon our arrival in January. So despite the demands of absorbing the new model aircraft and crews, the time living ashore was a benefit to all of us, a fairly relaxing time. My crew moved into the old post office building, a wooden structure right by the seaplane ramp, the best quarters we'd had since leaving Kaneohe in August '44. More engine problems. During the month of March '45, we continued to be plagued by engine problems. Crew 6, returning from patrol and still 450 miles from Saipan, had their port engine suddenly shut down. The crew jettisoned everything possible from the plane, and Joe Pugh performed a great job of flying and brought the plane back to a safe landing in Tanapag Harbor. Crew 10 was next. They had flown to Ulithi to pick up our first new PBM-5. On the return trip, they lost all power and had to feather the starboard engine. I guess the squadron had learned all the tricks of the single-engine trade, and they made it into Tanapag without too much trouble. We all hoped this was not an omen of our continued engine bad luck. The Pratt & Whitney R2800-22, however, proved to be more dependable, and in the final analysis, they were a real step up from the Curtiss Wrights. I know personally I felt much safer on the PBM-5. Okinawa, here we come. The Chandeleur sailed on March 23rd, headed for the invasion of Okinawa, with some of our ground crew personnel and 2 of the air crews on board. The rest of the air crews remained ashore at Tanapag until they were scheduled to leave for Nansei Shoto, specifically Karamaretto, where the seaplane base was to be located during the Okinawa operation. One of our relief crews took the long way around getting to Saipan to join the squadron. Their trials and tribulations started when they were trying to get to Kaneohe for assignment to a squadron. John Valentine, a pilot in the crew, told me the whole story several years ago. John said, "Our crew, later to become Crew 10 of VPB-21, was formed in Banana River, Florida, with all members except the PPC. Lieutenant J.G. R.N. Welly came on board later when we moved to the Corpus Christi, Texas Naval Air Station to pick up a new plane. We left Corpus Christi on December 22, 1944, for San Diego, where we continued our training until February 4, 1945. In the latter part of this training, we had to do a simulated trans-Pacific flight to Kaneohe Bay. We assumed that this would be easy. All we had to do was go out the designated distance, make a 180-degree turn, and end up back at base in San Diego. So we decided we wouldn't even need any star sights to help navigate. We goofed up good and ended up in Los Angeles rather than San Diego. Our commanding officer was not too pleased with our performance and told us very succinctly that we would do it until we got it right. To ensure that we took star sights this time, he sent a wave navigation officer along with us. This was to no avail, inasmuch as we ended up this time south of Tijuana, Mexico. We finally got back to San Diego, and then the weather hit a bad spell, and all flying was canceled for the next day or so. All we had to do was report for muster and then goof off the rest of the day. One of the more advantageous members of the crew, however, decided to run up the coast to Los Angeles for a little liberty. He arranged to have someone answer him at muster the next morning. So everything was fine, until the weather began clearing later in the day and we were told to prepare to leave for Kaneohe that night. Our very able flight engineer formulated some engine discrepancy to get us a few hours delay while we desperately tried to reach our wandering boy in L.A., but we couldn't track him down. We had given up, but fortunately he did report in shortly before 1700 hours, our newly planned departure time. We took off shortly thereafter, about 1740. At our pre-flight briefing, another in a series of humorous events, we were told to be on the lookout for Japanese balloons carrying incendiary devices. The Japanese had been putting these aloft, hoping that the prevailing wind currents would bring them across the Pacific to the west coast of the U.S. to cause some havoc. This was rather ludicrous, not only for the ineffectiveness of the concept, but also that we'd be flying at night, and they made it rather difficult to look for anything like a balloon. We gave up trying rather quickly. There were several incidents in 43 and 44 of incendiary balloons actually reaching Oregon and starting forest fires. After we were about 7 to 8 hours out, which was our point of no return, we realized we had a real crapshoot to face. With a 45-knot headwind, and knowing fuel was always a stretch on this flight of some 2,200 miles, we had a tough decision to make. We quickly decided to continue on rather than return to the scene of our fiascos. We also decided to change our heading from Kaneohe to the nearest of the Hawaiian Islands, the island of Hawaii. Once there, if we still had enough fuel, we would head across the island to Oahu, and from there to Kaneohe Bay. We did make it to Kaneohe and landed, with 5 minutes of fuel remaining. Now we knew all their fine training had paid off. Well, we did get there. Another of the relief crews, Crew 3, had an interesting flight, also as they made the transit from the west coast to Kaneohe. They were about 500 to 600 miles from Kaneohe when they lost all oil pressure in the starboard engine. They rigged the plane for single engine and proceeded to Kaneohe with a few of the usual prayers. When they landed and were towed up on the ramp, Ted Pohamas, the plane captain, filled out the flight discrepancy sheet, informally called the yellow sheet, that had to be completed after every flight to inform the maintenance people how the plane had performed and to point out repairs needed. There was particular emphasis on immediate repairs. After completing the form, the PPC, Lieutenant Michael Stovall, signed off as required. Ted had noted specifically on the form that, quote, the plane would not be flown again before it is ground tested and water tested for airworthiness, end quote. After turning in the discrepancy sheet to maintenance and securing the plane on the ramp, Ted and the rest of the crew retired to the barracks. Early next morning, Ted and Stovall were awakened with a summons to the office of the air station commanding officer. Ted was on his way to meet Stovall when he learned that the plane, allegedly worked on all night, had been given to another crew for an early morning flight. A few miles out of Kaneohe, it had exploded in flames, killing everyone on board. As few pilots really read a discrepancy sheet, Stovall, knowing he'd be on the hot seat, wanted to know what Ted had reported. Ted related in some detail his specific remarks about testing the plane before flying. The interrogation by the CO, an admiral, was primarily directed at Stovall, but when concluding, the admiral turned and said to Ted, "Sailor, you sure saved your ass and your skippers by noting that the plane was not to be flown again until proper assessments were made." When Ted told me this story recently, he said, "I don't know who was responsible for the poor judgment in flying that aircraft, but 10 men lost their lives. It could have been us." I had a similar incident when I came back to the States and was training a new crew at the Naval Air Station, Banana River, Florida. 13 men were killed in that explosion.